The wind blew across the empty prairie, carrying with it the scent of dust, grass, and loss. Inside the small wooden house at the edge of the ranch, a man sat slumped in a rocking chair, a baby cradled in his trembling arms. The child's cries pierced the silence again and again, a sound that tore through his already shattered soul. His wife, Mary, had been gone only 2 weeks, taken suddenly by fever after childbirth, and the house that once echoed with laughter now felt hollow and cruel. Luke Grayson wasn't a man who cried often, but the helpless sobs of his newborn son broke something inside him. He had faced storms that crushed barns, droughts that burned his fields, and winters that froze cattle to bone. But nothing, had prepared him for this. He could rebuild fences, mend broken tools, and fight through pain, but he couldn't feed his own child. The baby's tiny lips searched for milk that would never come, his fragile body weakening with each passing hour. Luke had sent word to the nearest town, asking for help, for anyone who might know what to do. But the nearest midwife lived miles away, and wagons weren't always kind to the desperate. Each night, he prayed, clumsy, desperate prayers whispered into the dark, for a miracle. But none came, until that evening. The knock came soft at first, then firmer, against the wooden door. Luke almost didn't move. He was half asleep in his grief, half lost in a haze of exhaustion and hunger himself. The baby whimpered again, a sound so weak it chilled his heart. When he opened the door, the wind carried the scent of rain, and behind it stood a woman. Her clothes were soaked from the storm, clinging to her form. She looked like she had walked miles, maybe days. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, but her eyes, those eyes were alive, searching, trembling with something unspoken. She held a shawl close around her chest, and when she saw the baby in Luke's arms, something deep and instinctive flickered across her face. "Please," Luke said, his voice rough and broken. "If you've come for work, it'll have to wait. My boy, he won't eat. He won't stop crying." The woman's eyes softened. She took a small, hesitant step closer. "I heard the crying from the trail," she said quietly. I've lost a child myself. But I still have milk. If you'll allow me." For a moment, Luke froze. He didn't know her. He didn't even know her name. But desperation stripped away pride. He stepped aside, unable to speak. She entered, her bare feet leaving wet marks on the floor. Gently, she reached for the baby, her arms trembling as she took him, wrapping him against her chest. The child whimpered once more before finding warmth, before quieting as he latched. Luke turned away, his throat burning. The only sound was the soft rhythm of rain against the window and the small, hungry gulps of his son feeding. The woman, her name, she said later, was Clara, stayed the night. She hadn't meant to end up here. She was headed west, fleeing a life of her own kind of heartbreak. Her husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her penniless and alone. The baby she'd carried had been stillborn only a month before. The milk had come anyway, and it had become a haunting reminder of what she'd lost. In that small house, grief met grief. 2 souls, both stripped of everything, now bound by a hungry infant who had unknowingly saved them both. Luke found himself watching Clara in quiet awe. The way she hummed softly to calm the baby, the gentleness in her touch, the way she whispered as if the child could understand every word. Something in his chest ached, not just from loss, but from a deep, wordless gratitude. Days turned into weeks. Clara stayed, helping him with the baby, with meals, with chores that Luke had nearly abandoned. He offered her pay, but she refused. "You don't owe me," she said. "He needs me. That's all that matters." But it wasn't long before Luke began to realize how much he needed her too. She filled the house with quiet warmth again, the kind that came not from words but from presence. She never asked about his wife, and he never pried into her past. They simply worked side by side, each day softening the ache that once felt unbearable. One night, long after the baby had fallen asleep, Luke found Clara sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon. The stars shimmered above, the land stretching endless and still. "You should rest," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "I can't sleep. Some nights, the memories come too strong." He sat beside her, the boards creaking under their weight. "You've lost a lot," he said quietly. "So have you." They sat in silence for a long while. The wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. When Clara finally turned to him, her eyes glistened, not with sorrow, but with something tender, uncertain. Maybe we were both sent here, she said. For him, and maybe for each other. Luke couldn't speak. His throat tightened as he looked at her, this woman who had walked into his life carrying nothing but pain and compassion, and realized she had given him something more precious than milk or help. She had given him hope. The next morning, the baby's laughter filled the house for the first time. Clara held him close, her smile radiant in the morning light. Luke stood by the doorway, his heart heavy yet full, knowing that somehow, through loss and fate, the three of them had begun to heal. The prairie still stretched endless and lonely beyond the ranch, but inside that small home, there was life again, fragile, beautiful, and real. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life on the ranch began to settle again, though never as it once was. The world still seemed to carry the echo of grief, but it no longer felt hollow. Clara had filled the silence with her presence, gentle, steady, and quietly strong. Luke found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain, as though the earth itself had shifted beneath him, guiding his weary soul toward hers. Each morning, he woke to the soft hum of her voice as she sang to the baby. Sometimes he paused outside the small room, just listening. Her song carried something more than melody, it carried peace, a kind of warmth that soothed his heart like sunlight after a storm. The child, little Samuel, had grown stronger, his cheeks round and his eyes bright. He had taken to Clara completely, as though he knew, in some wordless way, that she was the reason he'd survived. When Luke watched her cradle him, he often felt a pang, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that he dared not name. One evening, after supper, the wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of wildflowers. Luke had just set the dishes aside when he looked across the table and saw Clara laughing softly at something the baby had done. Her laughter, so rare in those early days, caught him off guard. It was light, melodic, like something he hadn't heard in years. "You should laugh more," he said quietly. She looked up, startled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I haven't had much reason to." "You do now," he murmured. "You brought life back here. I don't think you even know how much." Clara's gaze lingered on him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. She didn't answer, but something unspoken passed between them, something fragile, tender, and electric. That night, after the baby had been put to sleep, Luke found himself stepping out onto the porch again. The sky stretched endlessly above, a tapestry of stars scattered across the black. He heard the door creak softly behind him and turned. Clara stood there, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose and glinting in the faint light. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "Haven't been able to, not much since she passed. Some nights, it feels wrong to close my eyes. Like I'll lose something more if I rest." Clara came to stand beside him. The distance between them was small, smaller than it had ever been. "You won't lose anything," she said softly. "You've already lost enough." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, after a long silence, his voice came low and raw. "You saved him. You saved both of us." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lantern inside. "Maybe we saved each other." The wind brushed past them, cool and gentle. Luke's hand trembled slightly as it found hers. It was an instinct, not planned, not thought through, just a desperate need for something real. Her fingers were small against his calloused palm, but when she didn't pull away, he felt something stir inside him that had long been buried. They stood that way for a while, saying nothing, the silence between them filled with the sound of crickets and the soft creak of the porch boards beneath their feet. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes said everything her lips couldn't, that she, too, carried a quiet ache, one that met his in the middle of all that empty prairie. The days that followed felt different. The air itself seemed to hold something delicate and alive between them. Clara worked with him in the fields now, helping where she could. He'd find himself glancing at her across the pasture, the way the wind tugged at her hair, the way her laughter broke through the solitude. And at night, when she'd rock Samuel by the fire, he'd sit close enough to feel her warmth, though neither dared speak of what was growing between them. One evening, a summer storm rolled in. The sky turned the color of iron, and rain began to fall in sheets. Luke ran outside to bring in the tools, and Clara stood in the doorway, calling to him over the thunder. When he finally stepped back in, soaked through, she was waiting with a towel and a worried look. "You'll catch your death out there," she said, taking his hat and setting it aside. He smiled faintly, the water dripping from his hair. Wouldn't be the worst thing I've faced. Don't say that, she whispered. Her voice shook, not from fear of the storm, but from something deeper. He looked at her then, really looked, the way the firelight kissed her skin, the way her lips trembled with words she couldn't bring herself to say. Slowly, he reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Clara. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. Luke, I don't know if I can lose someone again. You won't, he said, his voice low, steady. Not if I can help it. The thunder rolled again, distant now, fading beyond the hills. In that small cabin, the storm outside seemed to quiet as another kind of storm gathered in the space between them, softer, slower, but every bit as powerful. He took a step closer. She didn't move away. His hand came up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. For a moment, he hesitated, and then she leaned into his touch. The air between them was charged, and neither spoke as their foreheads touched, a simple, aching connection that said everything words could not. From that night on, something shifted between them. They moved together as though they had always belonged, sharing quiet meals, tending to Samuel, walking the fields at dusk. But beneath every glance, every small touch, there lingered the quiet pull of something unspoken, the knowledge that love had found them, even when both had stopped believing it ever could. Luke would catch himself watching her sometimes, how she bent to gather laundry, how she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening. He saw strength in her tenderness, and it stirred a warmth in him he hadn't felt since before Mary had passed. Yet, guilt sometimes shadowed it. He'd sit by the fire late at night, torn between mourning the woman he had loved and yearning for the one beside him now. Clara sensed it too. One night, she found him sitting alone, staring into the dying flames. You still think of her, she said softly. He nodded, not looking up. Every day. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on his knee. You should. She was part of you. I don't want to take that away. His gaze finally met hers, heavy with emotion. You're not taking anything away. You're giving me something back, something I thought I'd lost forever. Her eyes filled with tears, and when he reached for her, she went into his arms without hesitation. It wasn't about replacing what had been lost, it was about finding meaning again. Two broken hearts, learning to beat together. The weeks passed, and the prairie turned golden with summer. Luke taught Clara how to ride properly, her laughter echoing across the open fields as he steadied her reins. The child would giggle from his cradle near the porch, and for the first time, the ranch felt alive again. One evening, after a long day, Clara brought Samuel out onto the porch. The sun was sinking low, the sky painted in hues of rose and amber. Luke joined her, his arm brushing hers. He's getting strong, he said quietly. He'll be walking soon, she replied, smiling. Luke glanced at her, his heart tightening with a tenderness he could no longer contain. You've done more for him than I ever could. She looked at him, her eyes soft. We both saved him, Luke. He hesitated. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't just mean him. The moment hung between them, fragile and electric. She turned toward him fully, her breath trembling as he stepped closer. The air smelled of rain and grass and something sweeter, the promise of what had been building between them for months. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't hurried or desperate. It was slow, reverent, the meeting of two souls that had wandered too long in sorrow. Her hands trembled against his chest, his thumb traced her jaw, and for a brief, endless moment, the world fell away. They pulled apart only when Samuel stirred, his soft cry grounding them both back to reality. Clara smiled, a little breathless, a little shy, and went to tend to him. Luke watched her go, his chest heavy with gratitude, awe, and something fierce, a love born not from passion alone, but from healing. That night, when the lamp was turned low and the house had gone quiet, Luke stood by the window, looking out over the land he'd once thought would bury him in loneliness. Behind him, Clara lay with Samuel sleeping close to her. The sound of their breathing filled the room, steady and safe. He turned back, his gaze lingering on her. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel haunted by the past. He felt anchored, to her, to the child, to the life they were building out of the ashes of loss. And as the wind whispered across the plains outside, Luke knew that something sacred had taken root in that little house, something born of sorrow, tempered by kindness, and kept alive by the quiet, unyielding power of love. Autumn came softly to the prairie, painting the hills in gold and amber. The air carried the scent of harvest and the hush of change. For Luke and Clara, it was more than a season, it was a turning point, a gentle closing of the wounds that had once defined them. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm. Steady and sure, Samuel toddled now, curious and bright, his laughter echoing through the fields as he chased after the chickens or tumbled into piles of leaves. He had his mother's eyes, Mary's, but his smile belonged to both of them. Clara would kneel to steady him, her laughter mingling with his, and Luke would stand nearby, watching them with quiet wonder, as though afraid that if he blinked, they might disappear back into the grief he once knew. But they didn't. Each day they stayed, more real than the last. One crisp morning, Luke saddled his horse and asked Clara to ride with him. She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because Samuel had grown clingy, always reaching for her skirts. Yet Luke smiled and promised they'd be back before the boy awoke from his nap. They set off through the open fields, the horizon wide and glowing under the sun. They rode in silence for a while, the wind tugging at Clara's hair, her laughter rising when Luke urged his horse forward to tease her into a race. She followed, her heart light, her spirit freer than it had been in years. When they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Luke dismounted and helped her down. Together they stood, the land stretching endless before them, golden fields, cattle grazing, the faint line of the river shimmering in the distance. This was Mary's favorite spot, Luke said softly. She used to say it made her feel small in the right way, like she was part of something bigger than all the hurt. Clara listened, her hand finding his. She was right, she said. It's beautiful. He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. I thought I'd never come back here. After she passed, I couldn't face it. It felt like standing at the edge of everything I'd lost. Clara turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. And now, he looked at her then, really looked, and smiled with a softness that reached his eyes. Now it feels like the start of everything I have left. Her breath caught. The words were simple, but they carried everything she'd hoped and feared and prayed for. Luke took her hands in his thumb tracing slow circles over her skin. Clara, he said, his voice steady, I don't know what tomorrow brings. I still think of her, and maybe I always will. But when I think of home, it's you. You and him. You're what keeps this place alive. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of release. I don't want to replace her, she said softly. I just want to be here, for you, for him. For whatever this life still has left to give. He cupped her face, his touch gentle, reverent. Then stay, he whispered. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I was never leaving. They stood together on that ridge until the wind carried the chill of evening, and the sun sank low, casting long shadows over the land. When they rode back, the lamps in the house glowed warmly, and Samuel's laughter drifted through the open door. The following weeks passed quietly. Luke and Clara began to move like a family in truth, not just in heart. The neighbors, at first cautious, began to accept her, the woman who had come from nowhere and given life back to the Grayson Ranch. And though the gossip of small towns never truly dies, Luke paid it no mind. He knew what they had was something real, something born of the hardest kind of love, the kind forged in loss, not lust. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the fields, and the nights grew long and still. Inside, the hearth burned bright. Clara would sit by the fire with Samuel in her lap, telling him soft stories while Luke repaired tools or read from the old Bible Mary had once kept by the bed. Sometimes, their eyes would meet over the firelight, repaired tools or read from the old Bible Mary had once kept by the bed. Sometimes, their eyes would meet over the firelight, a quiet promise passing between them without need for words. One night, after Samuel had fallen asleep, Luke placed another log on the fire and turned to her. Clara, he said quietly, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we made this right. You, me, the boy. I don't want to live halfway anymore. Her heart stilled. What are you saying? He knelt before her, taking her hand in both of his. Marry me. Not to fix what's broken. Not to replace what was lost. But to build what's next. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling before she could speak. She nodded, unable to find words, her heart too full. Luke smiled, his forehead resting against hers, and in that small, sacred moment, the past and present met, pain and love, grief and grace, all blending into something whole. They married quietly in spring, under the oak by the house. The preacher spoke simple words, and Samuel clapped his hands as though he understood every one. The air was soft, the world green again, and when Luke took Clara's hand in his, there was no doubt left in him, no fear, no guilt, only gratitude. That evening, as the stars rose over the prairie, Luke stood on the porch with his arm around Clara's waist, Samuel asleep in her arms. The wind carried the smell of blooming grass and earth after rain. "It's strange," she said softly. "For so long, I thought life had taken everything from me." Luke pressed a kiss to her hair. "Maybe it had to make room for this." She leaned into him, closing her eyes as his warmth surrounded her. The silence between them was full, not of loss but of everything they'd found. And as the night stretched wide around them, the ranch stood quiet and alive, a place reborn through love, a home made not from what had been lost, but from what had been found in the wreckage. Luke held her closer, his voice a whisper against her ear. "You saved me, Clara." She smiled through her tears. "No," she whispered back. "We saved each other." The stars burned above them, timeless and bright, and for the first time in years, Luke felt at peace, the ache in his chest replaced by the steady, endless rhythm of love that would outlast even the prairie wind.